Good morning, Kingsway. Pastor Todd here. And before we get into the message, I want to read for you the story that is at the heart of this day of Epiphany, which is found in Matthew's recounting of the Christmas story, Matthew chapter 2, and I'll be reading from verses 1 through 12. So hear now these words of the evangelist Matthew. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born the King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today we are observing Epiphany, the day which commemorates the coming of the Magi, also often referred to as the three wise men, or less commonly these days as the three kings. Foreign priests from a pagan land, a pagan religion, who travel to Jerusalem seeking to honor the child who has been born the King of the Jews. In Greek, Epiphany means something like manifestation. It's a word that comes from a verb that means to reveal. Matthew's Magi are as well known a part of the Christmas story as Luke's shepherds and the angel choir. But focus on this aspect of the biblical Christmas story has been somewhat heightened this year because of the convergence of Jupiter and Saturn in the night sky just before Christmas in 2020. There's been a lot of speculation that this could have been the star that the Magi saw. Perhaps. Certainly, such conjunctions are brilliant and exceptional celestial events that would have gotten the attention of those like the ancient Magi who studied and sought to interpret what they saw in the heavens. Of course, in the final analysis, we can wonder and we can postulate, but we can't really know. The Christmas star remains a bit of a mystery, much like the Magi themselves, in fact. We really have no idea who they were or how many of them there were. Matthew never gives us a number. We only assume there were three because they come bringing three gifts. Matthew also does not record their names. The names Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar that you may sometimes hear bestowed upon the Magi derive from much later tradition in the Middle Ages. We know they come from a distant land, and Magi were associated with Persia, but again, Matthew gives us no direct or detailed information. That's why I'm quite fond of images depicting the Magi's journey that cast them in silhouette traveling in the light of the star they are following. You may have received a Christmas card featuring such an image. There's also one such image up on the screen right now. They become rather commonplace, especially in our digital clip art world. They're fairly simple to produce, but however unintentionally, they're also quite poignant. For one thing, putting the Magi in silhouette puts the emphasis on the light that's guiding them rather than on them, which is where the focus should be. For another thing, it acknowledges the mystery that's attached to them and to their story. And thirdly, it allows us to fill that blank, opaque outline with meaning rather than biography, to focus on what they stand for, what their presence in the Christmas story is all about, what it means, especially what it means for us now, we who are reading, remembering, and retelling this story all of these many centuries later. Now, Matthew himself focuses on connecting the Magi with an oracle of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 6, to be exact. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. This is where we get that idea that the Magi, the three wise men, may have been three kings. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and they shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. But there is another broader but equally important connection to God's promises of the past, to the ways in which we've seen God at work in the past, that is important to connect here to the coming of the Magi. And that is that God has a habit of using unlikely people to do exceptional things, heavenly things. God has a history of bypassing the usual suspects when calling people to undertake, to embody, to promote, and fulfill God's purposes. People like Abram and his wife Sarai, who become the patriarch and matriarch of Israel. People who didn't know God, who didn't worship God previously. God chose them out of the blue one day. And Abram responded to God's voice, God's calling, by moving everything he had and everyone connected to his household from Haran in what is now southeast Turkey to Palestine just north of Egypt. He went with nothing but a promise to become the father of many nations, even though he and Sarai were both old and didn't have any children of their own, and an invitation to enter into a land that this unfamiliar yet captivating and compelling God would show them. Abram and Sarai were the first unlikely people God called, but they wouldn't be the last, not by a long shot. In the lineage of the promise, in an ancient culture where the firstborn son received the inheritance and the birthright, it is so often the younger children through whom God's story builds and continues. It is Jacob, Abraham's younger grandson, rather than Esau, his older brother, who becomes the eponymous father of Israel. It is Joseph, Jacob's youngest son, who becomes the center of the story once Jacob's family finds their way to Egypt. It is David, Jesse's youngest son, who becomes not only king, but Israel's greatest king. King of Israel, God's chosen nation, whom God calls to be a light to all other nations, but which is never itself a political or military power on the world stage. In fact, for most of Israel's history, God's people were occupied, beholden to, or absorbed into larger imperial entities, such as Assyria, Babylon, and Rome. And when Israel goes astray, it is often unlikely people whom God raises up to be God's prophets. Amos wasn't a prophet or the son of a prophet, but God made him one when he called him up out of the pastures and the sycamore groves of the southern kingdom to go and confront the people and the leaders of the northern kingdom. Likewise, Malachi emerged from Moresheth, a small village of small-scale agriculture on the border of Judah and Philistia. And these are just a few of the many examples from the Old Testament that we could name. More important, though, is to note how the pattern continues in and through the New Testament. Jesus, the Messiah, is born among the livestock in Bethlehem on Christmas night, not among the elite in the court in Jerusalem, Judea's capital. And when this Messiah grows up and sets out upon his mission and his ministry, he doesn't go to the synagogue or the temple school to find his disciples. He goes walking along the lakeshore and through the countryside. And when this Messiah rises on Easter morning, he sends a woman formerly possessed of demons to go and tell Peter and the others what has taken place. And when the church is being shaped and formed, who becomes the first great ambassador of the kingdom, the first great church planter across the Mediterranean world? A man who had once been the church's fiercest and staunchest critic, and who responded to the Apostle Paul's message of Jesus, the good news of the gospel, most readily. Not Paul's fellow Jews, the chosen people of the covenant, the ones who know and possess the backstory. No, the pagan, unclean Gentiles, people like these strange foreign magi who show up in Jerusalem asking about the child who has been born King of the Jews. A question that flummoxes the Jewish king and his expert scribes and priests. The presence of the Magi in the Christmas story gives us a shake, reminds us of just how amazing and unusual this story of Christmas is, how powerful and how all-encompassing it is. It reminds us how much bigger it is than we ordinarily give it credit for. It's not just a story for the faithful, for the in crowd, for people like us gathered in church on a Sunday morning. Really, it's not enough to acknowledge how God uses unusual people. That God uses unusual people so much of the time. We also need to pay attention to how God and God's agents and God's Messiah, Jesus, often confront the in crowd, how they confront the usual suspects who we might argue should be the ones God is using as God's agents, who are on board with what God is doing. It is the in crowd, however, God's prophets address. It is the in crowd that Jesus challenges. It's the in crowd here in Matthew 2 in the court of Jerusalem who completely miss what God has accomplished and who have to be told by a band of pagan foreign priests. But that shouldn't altogether surprise us. If we've been paying attention at all to the story of Christmas, much less the larger story of God's work in the world that we see unfold throughout the scope of Scripture. Remember, it is the mighty that Mary prophesies will be brought down. And it is only Zechariah, John the Baptist's priest father, the one with standing and connections in education, who receives a demerit from the angel Gabriel when the Christmas story begins to unfold. It's not so important who the Magi are, but that the Magi are, and that they are here as part of the story of God's coming Messiah. Because their presence reminds us that in a very real way, Jesus can never be fully found inside the religious establishment. We have to seek him more broadly, outside these walls, outside this church community, out in the world, in the margins, with those on the margins, not just among the poor and the needy, but anyone that we deem foreign, who doesn't belong according to the rubrics that we design. Which begs a question. Where do we see ourselves? Where do you see yourself in the ongoing narrative of God's story? What does the Christmas story, full of all these unusual outside characters, tell us about those to whom we should be paying attention as we seek to understand what God is doing in our midst, what God is doing in our world, in the here and the now? The insiders, the people who meet our acceptance, our approval? Or do we need to turn at least some of our attention to the outsiders, to those who don't conform to expectations, who ruffle our feathers and unsettle our established, customary, and comfortable understandings of God and of self and of the world? When John the Baptist and Jesus start to challenge the Pharisees, who do you imagine they're speaking to? To you? To someone else? These are the questions that Epiphany brings to us. What might we be missing that God is doing right in our midst, right here in our backyard, that we need others, outsiders, someone unexpected to point and call our attention to? How do we need to hear Jesus and God's prophets speaking to us as insiders, as God's people, who want and desire, very much like the priests and the Pharisees and the scribes, to follow God, to do what is right, to do what is faithful, but in the midst of our familiar understandings are somehow missing something important? And so my prayer for us as a church, as we continue to set out into this new year, as we wrap up this season of Christmas, that we won't let go of the story of Christmas. We won't turn away from the light that has guided the Magi to Bethlehem, because we need that light. We need that light to continue to lead us further and more broadly than we are accustomed to looking. And so may the light of Christmas continue to light our way, to illumine our path and reveal what God is doing beyond the edges of our comfort and our present understanding, because God has so much more for us and more for the world. And for that, we can truly say, thanks be to God. Amen.